The radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. with the kind of static that meant someone was about to ruin Zoe Martinez's perfectly quiet Tuesday night. She'd been hoping for one of those rare shifts where the biggest emergency was helping Mrs. Patterson find her escaped cat or mediating a noise complaint between the college kids on Elm Street and their perpetually cranky neighbor. Unit 23, we have a possible break-in at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Silent alarm triggered, no response from homeowner. Zoe sighed and reached for her radio, already mentally cataloging the contents of the address. 1247 Oakwood Drive was the old Victorian house that had been under renovation for the past 6 months, owned by some guy from the city who'd bought it sight unseen and was apparently trying to restore it single-handedly. She'd driven past it dozens of times during her patrols, watching the slow transformation from abandoned eyesore to something that might eventually resemble the grand home it had once been. Unit 23 responding, she said into the radio, starting her patrol car and pulling away from the 24-hour diner where she'd been nursing her third cup of coffee and working on a crossword puzzle. Millbrook was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the most exciting crime of the month was usually teenage vandalism or the occasional drunk and disorderly at Murphy's Tavern. Zoe had moved here 3 years ago specifically because it was the opposite of the chaos she'd left behind in Chicago. No gang violence, no drug wars, no domestic disputes that ended with someone in the hospital or worse. As the only female officer on Millbrook's 4-person police force, and the only one who preferred working nights, Zoe had carved out a quiet niche for herself. She handled the late shift calls, kept an eye on the businesses during their closed hours, and made sure the teenagers had somewhere safe to hang out that wouldn't get them into trouble. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was peaceful. And peace was exactly what Zoe had been looking for when she'd left her detective badge and her ex-fiancé behind in the city. She pulled into the driveway of 1247 Oakwood Drive and immediately noticed the warm glow coming from the second-floor windows. If this was a break-in, it was the coziest break-in in criminal history. She could see someone moving around inside, definitely not the furtive movements of a burglar, but the steady, purposeful activity of someone who belonged there. Zoe grabbed her flashlight and approached the front door, noting the new paint job and the carefully restored porch railings. Someone had put serious time and money into bringing this place back to life. She knocked firmly on the front door, then stepped back and called out, "Police, I need to speak with whoever's inside." The movement upstairs stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of footsteps on hardwood floors. A moment later, the porch light flickered on, and the front door opened to reveal a man who definitely didn't look like a burglar. He was tall, probably 6'1", with dark hair that stuck up in places and paint-stained clothes that suggested he'd been working late into the night. His hands were dusty with what looked like drywall compound, and there was a streak of blue paint across his cheek that he'd apparently missed when washing his face. But what caught Zoe's attention were his eyes, deep brown and currently wide with surprise and what might have been embarrassment. "Officer, I'm so sorry," he said, holding up his hands in a gesture that was part surrender, part explanation. "I completely forgot about the alarm system. I've been working upstairs and lost track of time." "Are you the homeowner?" Zoe asked, though something about his presence here felt entirely legitimate. "Yes, ma'am. Lucas Reed. I can show you ID if you need it." He reached slowly toward his back pocket, clearly aware that sudden movements around police officers were generally inadvisable. "That would be helpful, Mr. Reed." Lucas handed her his driver's license, and Zoe checked it with her flashlight. Lucas Reed, age 32. Address matching the house they were standing in front of. Everything seemed to be in order, but protocol required her to verify the alarm situation and make sure everything was actually okay. "The alarm company reported a silent alarm activation," she explained. "They couldn't reach you by phone to verify that everything was okay. My phone's upstairs and I had music playing while I worked. I probably didn't hear it ring." Lucas ran a hand through his already messy hair, making it stand up even more. "I'm really sorry for the trouble. I keep forgetting that the alarm system is even active. I'm not used to living somewhere that requires one." "Where are you used to living?" "Chicago mostly. I bought this place 6 months ago as a restoration project. Been commuting back and forth on weekends, but I finally took a leave of absence from my job to focus on the renovation full-time." "Chicago. That explained the security system and his apologetic demeanor city reflexes in a small town setting. Zoe found herself curious about what had brought him from the urban chaos she'd left behind to the same small-town peace she'd been seeking. "Would you mind if I took a quick look around?" she asked. "Just to complete the report and make sure everything's secure." "Of course, come in, please, though I should warn you it's not exactly guest-ready at the moment." Lucas stepped aside to let her enter, and Zoe found herself in a foyer that took her breath away. The hardwood floors had been restored to a warm honey color that seemed to glow in the soft lighting. The staircase banister, probably original to the 1890s house, had been stripped and refinished to show off the intricate woodwork. Even half-finished, the space had the kind of character that modern houses tried to imitate but never quite achieved. "This is incredible," Zoe said, forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to be conducting an official investigation. "How much of this did you do yourself?" "Most of it. I'm learning as I go, which means everything takes about 3 times longer than it should, but I'm getting there." Lucas seemed pleased by her appreciation. "Would you like to see the rest? I mean, for the security check." Zoe followed Lucas through the first floor, noting the careful attention to detail in every room. He'd clearly researched the historical period and was restoring the house with authentic materials and techniques. The kitchen had been gutted and rebuilt with period-appropriate fixtures that somehow managed to include modern conveniences without looking anachronistic. "This must be costing a fortune," Zoe observed as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. "It is, but it's worth it. This house has good bones and someone should love it properly." Lucas paused on the landing. "I know that sounds ridiculous, getting emotionally attached to a building." "It doesn't sound ridiculous at all. Some places just feel like home." "Exactly. The moment I saw the listing photos, I knew I had to save it." The second floor was where Lucas had been working when the alarm triggered. One bedroom had been converted into a workspace, with restoration books scattered across a makeshift desk and samples of paint and wallpaper pinned to the walls. The room next to it was clearly where he'd been working that evening. Half the walls had been stripped of old wallpaper, and the other half showed the painstaking process of applying new paper that matched the original Victorian pattern. "You're doing the wallpaper yourself?" Zoe asked, impressed despite herself. "I watched about 50 YouTube videos and practiced on the closet wall first. It's harder than it looks, but I'm getting the hang of it." "Why not hire professionals for something this detailed?" Lucas was quiet for a moment, running his fingers along a seam where 2 pieces of wallpaper met perfectly. "I guess I want to know that I did it myself. That I didn't just throw money at a problem but actually learned something, actually put my own hands on every part of this process." Zoe understood that impulse more than she wanted to admit. After 3 years in Millbrook, she was still learning how to build a life that felt authentically hers, rather than just a reaction to what she'd left behind. "Well, everything looks secure," she said, completing her circuit of the upstairs rooms. "I'll let the alarm company know it was a false alarm. You might want to adjust the settings if you're planning to work late regularly." "I will. Thank you for being so thorough and patient. I know this was probably not the most exciting call of your evening." They walked back downstairs together, and Zoe found herself reluctant to leave. There was something about Lucas's passion for the restoration project, his willingness to learn new skills, his obvious love for the house, that made her want to know more about his story. "Can I ask what you did in Chicago?" she said as they reached the front door. "Marketing consulting, helping companies figure out how to sell things to people who don't really need them." Lucas's smile was self-deprecating. Not exactly fulfilling work, but it paid well enough to buy a Victorian house in small-town Wisconsin. "What made you leave?" "Long story, short version. I realized I was good at a job I hated, living in a city that exhausted me, dating someone who thought my restoration hobby was a waste of time and money." Lucas paused. "Sorry, that was probably more information than you were looking for." "Not at all. I moved here from Chicago too, actually. Different reasons, but I understand the appeal of starting over somewhere quieter." "Really, what brought you to Millbrook?" Zoe hesitated. She didn't usually share personal information with civilians, and she definitely didn't usually linger on routine calls to discuss life choices with handsome homeowners. But something about Lucas's openness, his willingness to admit that he was figuring things out as he went along, made her want to reciprocate. "I was a detective with Chicago PD. Got burned out on the violence, the politics, the feeling like nothing I did made a real difference. When I saw an opening here, it seemed like a chance to do police work that was actually about helping people instead of just documenting damage. Do you miss it? The big city, I mean. Sometimes. I miss the museums, the restaurants, the energy. But I don't miss feeling like I was constantly fighting a war I couldn't win. Lucas nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly how I felt about my job, like I was very good at something that didn't matter. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two refugees from urban life who had found their way to the same quiet town for similar reasons. Zoe realized she'd been standing in Lucas's doorway for nearly 20 minutes, far longer than any security check required. I should let you get back to your wallpaper, she said, stepping back toward her patrol car. Officer Martinez, Lucas said, reading her name tag. Would it be completely inappropriate for me to ask if you'd like to see the house when it's finished? I mean, if you're interested in restoration work. Zoe felt her cheeks warm with something that might have been pleasure. It wouldn't be inappropriate, and I'd like that. Great, I mean, it'll probably be another 6 months before everything's done, but I'm not going anywhere. As Zoe drove away from 1247 Oakwood Drive, she found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. There had been something about Lucas Reed, his passion for his project, his honesty about his life changes, his obvious intelligence tempered by genuine humility, that had awakened something in her she'd thought was permanently dormant. She'd moved to Millbrook to escape complications, to build a simple life focused on work and peace, and the kind of predictable routine that didn't include surprises or emotional risks. But maybe, she thought as she resumed her patrol through the quiet streets, some complications were worth the risk. 3 weeks later, Zoe found herself driving past 1247 Oakwood Drive more frequently than her patrol route strictly required. She told herself it was simple professional diligence checking on a property that had recently had security issues. But the truth was that she was curious about Lucas's progress on the restoration, and maybe slightly curious about Lucas himself. She'd seen him a few times from a distance, usually carrying supplies from his truck to the house or working in the yard during weekend daylight hours. He'd waved when he noticed her patrol car, but they hadn't had another conversation since that night shift encounter. On a quiet Thursday evening in late October, Zoe's radio crackled with a familiar address. Unit 23, we have a medical emergency at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Homeowner called for assistance. Zoe's stomach dropped. Unit 23 responding. Do we have details on the nature of the emergency? Homeowner reports a fall with possible injury. Ambulance is en route. Zoe hit her lights and siren, making the 10-minute drive to Oakwood Drive in 6 minutes. She arrived to find Lucas sitting on his front porch steps, holding a towel to his head and looking pale but alert. What happened? She asked, grabbing her first aid kit and kneeling beside him. I was working on the second-floor bathroom trying to remove an old fixture, and I managed to slip and hit my head on the corner of the vanity. Lucas moved the towel to show her a cut above his left eyebrow that was bleeding freely, but didn't look deep enough to require stitches. Are you dizzy, nauseous, any vision changes? A little dizzy, but I think that's more from embarrassment than actual injury. I've been doing construction work for 6 months without hurting myself, and then I managed to injure myself on a simple plumbing removal. Zoe cleaned the cut with supplies from her first aid kit. Noting that Lucas's pupils were equal and reactive, his speech was clear, and his color was improving. It happens to the best of us. Home renovation is more dangerous than people think. Voice of experience? I helped my dad renovate our basement when I was in high school. I learned that power tools and overconfidence don't mix well. The ambulance arrived as Zoe was applying a butterfly bandage to Lucas's cut. The EMTs confirmed her assessment that the injury was minor, but recommended that Lucas avoid working alone late at night, especially on projects that involved heights or heavy tools. I'll be more careful, Lucas promised as the EMTs packed up their equipment, and I'll invest in a better ladder. Good plan, Zoe said. You might also want to consider working during daylight hours when possible. Better visibility, and there are more people around if something goes wrong. You're right. I get into a zone when I'm working and lose track of time. After the ambulance left, Zoe lingered to make sure Lucas was steady on his feet and to help him turn off the power to the bathroom where he'd been working. Thank you for staying, Lucas said as they stood in his kitchen where he was making tea with the careful movements of someone whose head was still a little tender. Can I offer you coffee? Tea? I know you're probably supposed to get back to your patrol. Zoe checked her watch. It was nearly 11 p.m. and the night had been quiet except for Lucas's emergency call. Coffee would be great if it's not too much trouble. No trouble at all. Fair warning, the coffee might not be up to police standards. I'm still learning how to use the vintage percolator that came with the house. As Lucas prepared coffee with the focused attention of someone trying not to jostle his injured head, Zoe looked around the kitchen with new appreciation. Since her last visit, he'd installed period-appropriate light fixtures and completed the tile backsplash in a pattern that perfectly complemented the restored cabinets. "You've made incredible progress," she observed. "It's coming together faster now that I'm here full-time, though tonight's incident suggests I should probably slow down a little." "When did you move here permanently?" 2 weeks ago. I finally finished up my consulting contracts in Chicago and made the official move." Lucas handed her a mug of coffee that smelled significantly better than the station house brew. "It's strange being here all the time instead of just weekends. Quieter, but in a good way." "How are you adjusting to small-town life?" "Better than I expected. I was worried I'd feel isolated, but there's something peaceful about knowing all your neighbors and having the same cashier at the grocery store every time you shop." Lucas settled into a chair across from her at the small kitchen table. "What about you? Do you ever miss the excitement of big city police work?" Zoe considered the question while she tasted the coffee, which was indeed much better than she'd expected from a vintage percolator operated by someone with a head injury. "Sometimes I miss the feeling that every day brought something different. But I don't miss the feeling that every day brought something terrible. Here, when someone calls 911, it's usually because they actually need help, not because they want to hurt someone or cause problems. That's a significant difference." "It is. In Chicago, I spent most of my time documenting violence after it happened. Here, I get to prevent problems before they escalate, help people solve issues before they become emergencies. It feels more like actual police work and less like crime scene management." "Do you think you'll stay long-term?" "I think so. I like the community, I like the work, and I like feeling like I know my territory well enough to make a real difference." They talked for another hour, conversation flowing with the easy comfort of people who understood each other's choices. Lucas told her about his progress on different rooms, the challenges of finding authentic materials, the satisfaction of learning skills he'd never thought he'd need. Zoe shared stories about the quirky aspects of small-town policing, the difference between urban and rural crime patterns, the unexpected ways that community connections made her job easier. "I should let you get some rest," Zoe said finally, noting that Lucas was looking tired despite his obvious enjoyment of their conversation. "Head injuries require sleep, and you should probably take it easy tomorrow." "You're right. Thank you for staying, for the first aid for the company. This evening could have been much worse if you hadn't responded so quickly." "Just doing my job. Going above and beyond your job, I think." As Zoe gathered her equipment and prepared to leave, Lucas cleared his throat in a way that suggested he was working up courage for something. "Officer Martinez, Zoe, would you like to have dinner sometime? I mean, when I'm not bleeding from a head wound and you're not responding to my emergency calls." Zoe felt the same flutter of interest she'd experienced during their first meeting, but stronger now after an evening of genuine conversation and easy companionship. "I'd like that," she said, "but maybe somewhere public so people don't think I'm dating someone just because I responded to their 911 calls." "Small-town gossip considerations?" "Small-town gossip considerations. I understand completely. There's a new restaurant downtown Murphy's Bistro next to the old tavern. It's supposed to have excellent food and a very public dining room. Murphy's Bistro sounds perfect." As Zoe drove home that night, she reflected on the unexpected turns her evening had taken. She'd responded to a medical emergency and somehow ended up with her first dinner date in over a year. Lucas Reed was intelligent, passionate about his work, honest about his life changes, and apparently brave enough to ask out a police officer who'd seen him at his most vulnerable. Maybe it was time to consider that avoiding complications wasn't the same as finding happiness. Maybe some risks were worth taking, especially when they involved someone who understood the courage it took to start over somewhere new. Their first official date took place the following Saturday evening at Murphy's Bistro, which turned out to be surprisingly sophisticated for a restaurant in a town of 3,000 people. Lucas had made reservations and arrived exactly on time, looking considerably better than he had with a head wound and covered in construction dust. "How's the head?" Zoe asked as they were seated at a table near the window. "Completely healed thanks to excellent emergency medical care." Lucas's smile was warm and slightly self-deprecating. "I've also invested in better safety equipment and a policy of no construction work after 9 p.m. "Good plan. What's the status of the bathroom renovation?" "Completed successfully with no additional injuries. I even managed to install the vintage fixtures without electrocuting myself or flooding the house." Over dinner, that was indeed excellent for a small-town restaurant. Zoe learned more about Lucas's background. He'd grown up in a suburb of Milwaukee, studied business in college because it seemed practical, and had spent 10 years building a successful consulting practice that he'd gradually realized was completely wrong for his personality and values. "I'm good at reading people and solving problems," he explained over the herb-crusted salmon that was the restaurant's specialty. "But I was using those skills to help corporations sell more products to people who already had too much stuff. It felt like a waste of whatever talents I have." "What do you want to do instead?" "I'm not entirely sure yet. Maybe historic preservation consulting, helping other people restore old buildings. Maybe teaching, sharing what I've learned about construction and renovation. Maybe just finishing this house and seeing what opportunities develop from there." "That's brave, not having a detailed plan. Or foolish, I guess time will tell." Zoe told Lucas about her own career transition, about the case that had finally made her realize she needed to leave Chicago police work behind, a domestic violence situation that had escalated to tragedy despite her best efforts to intervene. "I'd worked that case for weeks," she said, surprising herself with how much she was willing to share. "Multiple calls to the house, trying to convince the victim to press charges, working with social services to provide resources and support. I thought I was making progress, that she was going to leave him. But she didn't? She tried to. He killed her the night she was supposed to enter the safe house." Zoe's voice was steady, but Lucas could see the pain in her expression. "I knew it was statistically likely. I knew that leaving is the most dangerous time for domestic violence victims, but I thought I could prevent it. I thought being a good cop meant I could save everyone. I'm sorry, that must have been devastating." "It was. But it also taught me something important about the limits of what one person can do, and about the difference between failing and being overwhelmed by systems that don't work." "Is that when you decided to leave?" "That's when I started looking for alternatives. When the Millbrook position opened up, it seemed like a chance to do police work in a community where individual effort could actually make a difference." After dinner, they walked through downtown Millbrook, past the antique shops and art galleries that had begun attracting weekend tourists, past the old movie theater that showed second-run films and served real butter on their popcorn. "I like this," Lucas said as they paused in front of the bookstore that stayed open late on Saturdays for the book club that met in the back room. "The bookstore? The whole thing. The scale of it, the way people know each other, the feeling that what you do matters because everyone's connected. It's different from Chicago. Very different. Better, I think, at least for me." When they reached Zoe's car, parked outside the restaurant, Lucas hesitated in the way that suggested he was trying to decide whether to kiss her goodnight or shake her hand. "I had a wonderful time," he said finally. "So did I. Thank you for dinner. Would you like to do this again, maybe next weekend?" "I'd like that very much." Lucas leaned forward and kissed her cheek softly, a gesture that was sweet rather than presumptuous, promising rather than demanding. "I'll call you this week," he said. As Zoe drove home, she reflected on how much her life had changed in the span of a month. She'd moved to Millbrook seeking peace and predictability, but she was discovering that the best kind of peace came not from avoiding risks, but from taking the right risks with the right person. Over the next few months, Zoe and Lucas developed a relationship that felt both natural and deliberate. They had dinner every Saturday night, alternating between Murphy's Bistro and cooking at Lucas's house, which was slowly transforming into the Victorian showplace he'd envisioned. Zoe learned to appreciate the satisfaction of restoration work, helping Lucas with projects that didn't require specialized skills. Lucas learned to understand the rhythms of small-town police work, bringing Zoe coffee during her late shifts and listening to her stories about the community she served. "You're good at this," Zoe observed one Sunday afternoon as they worked together to install a restored mantelpiece in the front parlor. "Not just the technical stuff, But the problem solving, the attention to detail. You should consider that preservation consulting idea seriously. I've actually been thinking about it more, Lucas said, adjusting the level on the mantelpiece for the third time to make sure it was perfectly straight. There are a lot of historic properties in this region that could use expert restoration, and I've learned enough now to teach other people how to do it properly. What's holding you back? Fear, mostly. Fear of failing at something I actually care about instead of something I'm just good at. Zoe understood that distinction. The work that mattered always carried higher stakes than the work that was just a paycheck. What would you need to make it happen? Certification in historic preservation, probably some formal training in construction management, definitely a better understanding of the business side of consulting. Lucas paused in his measuring. And courage to actually try it. The courage part might be easier than you think. You've already proven you can learn complex skills and complete challenging projects. With help, Lucas said, smiling at her. Having someone who believes in you makes a significant difference. That evening, as they sat on Lucas's restored front porch drinking wine and watching the sunset, Zoe felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. The house was nearly finished, just a few rooms left to complete, and it had exceeded even Lucas's ambitious vision. But more than that, she felt like she was building something meaningful with someone who shared her values and understood her choices. "Zoe," Lucas said, setting down his wine glass and turning to face her. "I need to tell you something." "Okay." "I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I've been falling in love with you since that first night when you showed up to investigate my alarm malfunction and ended up appreciating my restoration work." Zoe felt her heart speed up with something that was part joy, part terror. "Lucas, I know we haven't been dating very long. I know you moved here to focus on your career and find peace, not to get involved in a relationship. But I also know that what we have is real, and I wanted you to know how I feel." Zoe looked at Lucas's face, seeing hope and vulnerability and the kind of genuine affection that she'd thought existed only in romance novels. She thought about the months they'd spent together, the easy compatibility, the way he encouraged her work while respecting her independence, the way she'd started looking forward to their Saturday dinners and Sunday project sessions more than anything else in her week. "I'm falling in love with you too," she said softly, "which terrifies me because I came here to avoid complications, and you're definitely a complication. Good complication or bad complication? The best kind of complication, the kind that makes everything else better instead of more difficult." When Lucas kissed her on the porch of the house he'd restored with his own hands, Zoe felt like she was finally home, not just in Millbrook, but in this moment, with this person, building something together that was more beautiful than either of them could have created alone. A year later, Zoe moved into 1247 Oakwood Drive, bringing with her the few belongings that had survived her transition from city life to small-town living. Lucas had started his historic preservation consulting business, working with property owners throughout Wisconsin and Minnesota to restore buildings that might otherwise have been demolished. Zoe had been promoted to sergeant, the youngest person ever to hold that rank in Millbrook's police department. "Do you ever miss the excitement of emergency calls at 2 a.m.? Lucas asked one evening as they worked together in the garden, planting perennials that would bloom in the spring. "I still get emergency calls at 2 a.m., Zoe replied, tamping soil around a collection of daffodil bulbs. "They're just different kinds of emergencies. Mrs. Patterson's cat, teenagers making too much noise, the occasional domestic dispute that actually gets resolved with conversation instead of arrests. Better emergencies? Manageable emergencies. Emergencies where I can usually help instead of just documenting damage." Lucas paused in his planting to look at the house they now shared, its Victorian elegance fully restored and glowing warm in the evening light. "Do you think we'll stay here long-term? Build a life in Millbrook?" "I think we already are building a life in Millbrook," Zoe said. "The question is whether that life will include the things we want long-term." "What do you want long-term?" Zoe considered the question while she arranged bulbs in a pattern that would create a natural-looking spring display. "I want work that matters, a community where I can make a difference, someone to share it all with who understands why it matters. I want to help you build your business, watch you teach other people how to save beautiful old buildings, maybe travel to some of your projects." "What about family, kids?" "Maybe, someday. with the right person in the right place at the right time. And is this the right person and place and time? Zoe looked at Lucas, his hands dirty from gardening, his hair messed up from the breeze, his expression hopeful, but patient. She thought about the journey that had brought them both to this moment. The career changes, the geographic moves, the courage to start over in a place where they could become who they really wanted to be. Ask me again in a year, she said, smiling. When the garden's blooming and your business is established and we've figured out how to share a bathroom without arguing about toothpaste tubes. Deal. But for the record, I think this is exactly the right person and place and time. For the record, I think you might be right. That night, as they lay in the bedroom Lucas had restored with hand-selected period wallpaper, and Zoe had furnished with furniture that was comfortable rather than historically accurate, Zoe reflected on the unexpected paths that had led her to this life. She'd thought happiness meant avoiding risk, maintaining control, building a predictable routine that couldn't be disrupted by other people's choices or needs. But Lucas had taught her that the best kind of happiness came from choosing the right risks, from building something meaningful with someone who shared your values and respected your independence. Tomorrow she would return to her patrol routes, keeping watch over a community that had become truly home. Lucas would continue work on his latest project, a 1920s craftsman house, whose owners wanted to restore it to its original beauty while adding modern conveniences. They would have dinner together, work in their garden, plan weekend trips to antique stores where Lucas could find authentic fixtures for his restoration projects. It was a quiet life, a peaceful life, the kind of life that might have seemed boring to the people they'd been in Chicago. But it was also a life filled with purpose, connection, and the deep satisfaction that came from building something beautiful together. Zoe Martinez Reed fell asleep grateful for false alarms that led to real connections, for the courage to start over in a place where she could become her best self, and for finding someone brave enough to restore not just old houses, but also the belief that love could be both safe and extraordinary.